Hello, everybody, and good morning. Thanks for joining me. I'm Dr. John Tomeček from Texas A&M University and the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. I'm an assistant professor and wildlife extension specialist here in Texas. The majority of my work being on wildlife damage management and wildlife diseases, certainly pigs being something that crosses both of those worlds. So excited today to bring you some results from some work that we've been doing on the human dimensions of wild pig management here in Texas over the last couple of years. And so it's important to note that we in Texas have one of the distinctions of being some of the worst pig problems, but also some of the longest running educational programs on pigs. So we want to convey our lessons that we've learned from the last 30 years and where the future will take us. So just to give a little bit of a background here, as far as us doing extension education from our extension service, currently the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service and its predecessor agencies, we started those dedicated efforts in about 1990. My predecessor, Dr. Billy Higginbotham, who many of you know, started a dedicated pig education event in 1990, addressed primarily at damage to agricultural producers. In fact, during that time, as Billy would remark if you asked him today, only folks that were agricultural producers and actively experiencing damage attended that meeting. So certainly since the year 1990, quite a lot has changed, both in our society, folks that experience pig damage, and folks' opinions, attitudes, and uses of pigs. And yet during that time, many of our extension educational messages have remained the same, as well as our modes of delivery, be that in-person, electronic publications, so on and so forth. So how do we take a step back and look at 30 years of doing extension education on wild pig management and ask ourselves, are we still effective? Are we still relevant? What have we done well? And what can we do better? So essentially, how can we measure our effectiveness and adapt to a changing world, both in terms of human society, but also in terms of the pig problem as it's changed over the last 30 years? So to remind everybody, from our point of view, when we look at extension wild pig education in Texas, and again, remembering this is only from the point of view of our extension service, we have a few priorities that we maintain and have maintained over the years. First and foremost, whatever our clientele's needs and problems are, we address those. Those are our kind of gold standard items that we're asked to address. We also have to make sure that we're providing education that's not only timely in addressing the issues of the day, but also transformative that permeates society. So in this sense, we need to provide education that doesn't just tell somebody about something, but rather provides them a way forward to change their behavior, to do something better, handle a problem themselves. And essentially, this transformation is one of our marks of success. At the end of the day, our other item that we have to do is make lasting changes in behavior that enhance the lives of Texans as well as Texas's natural resources. And so our ability to teach well enough and relevantly enough to have these changes occur, one would think over 30 years, we would be able to say, look where we began, look where we are now, and we can show you mile markers along the road. The reality is this measurement of effectiveness is something that many of us have struggled with over the years in terms of outreach education, not just in extension, but in other groups, and in terms of biological management. How do we check in periodically to make sure we're doing our job? Well, we conduct surveys. Within extension education, one thing that we have not always done is followed up to see if our efforts are quote unquote hitting the mark, if we are indeed making the progress we need to, and if we're providing the education that we need to. So our research that we've conducted over the last couple of years seeks to better understand the impacts, economics, attitudes, and knowledge of wild pigs on various stakeholder groups in Texas. As we know, in the earliest days, the only folks who cared much about pigs in Texas were those that were agricultural producers in rural environments. And to wit, in the 1980s and early 90s, the state's attitude about wild pigs from a governmental standpoint was that, quote, hunters will fix the problem, and, quote, this is a rural person's problem, which we know today is not true and has changed over the years. So we've conducted some evaluations of folks over the last couple of years to ask ourselves the question, how have we worked with this public and these issues? How have our educational resources been used over the years? And how have we done in terms of improving wild pig management efforts? And what are issues that we still have left to fix? So just to give a quick overview of how we went about this, we took folks in the year 2018 and surveyed them using a mixed mode survey instrument along the Dillman design. We implemented that and designed it using the Qualtrics survey software program. And much of this related in terms of Likert scale questions, true false questions, these types of things. It was a fairly robust survey, 74 questions in total, all of which I will not get into today. Obviously, we'll focus down on just a few, but we asked questions in terms of folks in interactions with a hunting perspective, a damage management perspective, and a damage experience perspective, and their use of extension education. So in terms of within Texas, we only sampled within the state of Texas. We reached a number of groups. We specifically reached out to our extension service clientele through our county offices, so the folks that come to our events, licensed hunters through data provided by the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. We did also reach out to various groups that are hunting groups, commodity groups, conservation groups, and other associations to get a feeling for the broader public outside of our clientele and just licensed hunters within the state of Texas. So in terms of response rates, to highlight the two, we had most of our survey contacts and our respondents from AgriLife Extension Service contacts. We contacted a little over 41,000 folks. We had about a 13% response rate. Among Texans licensed hunters, we contacted 161,914 licensed hunters in Texas, and we had a response rate of about 22%. These were all done, again, electronically via email. We did conduct a traditional mail-out survey just to compare responses. We didn't find a significantly different response among those purely through paper and purely through email. Thus, we continued with our email survey due to practical limitations. So to get into it, in terms of our educational resources, about 68% of our respondents reported having ever used some kind of extension educational resource to learn about wild pigs, which is pretty great for us in terms of almost three quarters of our folks responded with, yes, indeed, we have used some kind of educational resource. We do know who the extension service is and what they do. And that's great. So these resources, in terms of what they could be, included in-person events, publications, articles in mass media, web-based materials, social media, so on and so forth. So the question we asked is, among all of these things, how have we been most effective at reaching clientele over the last 30 years, recognizing, of course, that some things didn't come about until much more recently. So when you look at the breakdown, this was a select as many as are relevant question. So you'll see that the percentages don't necessarily add up to 100. But the vast majority of our respondents interacted with our educational resources primarily through traditional articles and publications. That shouldn't surprise us very much, as we've been doing this for a number of years. And the commentary from respondents was that these things are available no matter what time of day I have time to interact with them. Secondarily, folks went to our educational seminars, roughly 30%. And that's pretty good. 25% of folks actually had direct contact with clientele, staff relations out in the county. So those extension service county agents that we maintain in every county of the state to be a resource. Now, interestingly enough, we did have 15% of folks that said, I didn't use any AgriLife resources, and yet they told us that they used our resources. So we're a little bit conflicted here on what exactly they mean, but they may not be using any additional resources. Anything that is electronically related, online videos, social media, and then to a much smaller degree, webinars. They were used, but not quite as much. And this is interesting for us. So still these traditional methods are ways in which we reach most of our clientele. But remembering that these publications and articles are available no matter when you want them. And in today's world, we often provide PDFs of these items via email. So again, providing items whenever folks want them. So in terms of asking ourselves about educational outcome metrics, it was one thing we wanted to take a step back and say, over the last 30 years, there are some things that have not changed, some items that we have been consistent with in our education because they are unchanging items here in Texas. Some of these for 10, 20, or even the full 30 years that we have taught folks. So we use these as metrics to ask ourselves the question, how well do those responding to this survey retain and use the knowledge that we taught them, understanding that our messages have been consistent? Have we permeated a broader population with our education? So, in a broad sense, we asked folks to tell us, with several knowledge based questions, some things they know about pigs that we know we have taught consistently over the last 30 years and have surveyed to some extent. So, we know that most folks have a fairly basic knowledge of wild pigs. So, we wanted to hit at that and ask, among these very basic knowledge questions, which act as a marker of familiarity, what do you know? Because folks that are engaged in managing of pigs, and certainly folks that are hunters and engage in the outdoors, typically know quite a lot more about these species than the general public. From a broad sense, surprisingly, respondents only answered an average of 4 out of the 10 knowledge based questions with anything greater than a 50% accuracy. And again, these are true false. So this is a little bit startling for us. So let's examine what folks did know and what they didn't know. So forgive the little bit cumbersome graphic here. If you look at the top 4 questions, which are highlighted in blue, most folks got the correct answer to those, as is indicated by the colors bars on the screen. The bottom set of questions indicated in red, however, generally speaking, more than 50% at least, folks got those incorrect, which for us are pretty startling. So, generally speaking, folks understand that pigs are present in most Texas counties and that they carry diseases that can be spread to domestic animals, they can kill livestock and wildlife, and they breed year round. Folks understood those. What's interesting for us is that there's a pretty startling breakover in the understanding when we step away from those questions. Most folks do not know that pigs carry zoonotic diseases, that there are legal restrictions on the transport, release, and holding of live wild pigs in Texas, which is a startling problem for us because this is the source of much of our spread of pigs and the distribution of pigs throughout the state today. Most folks think that pigs are regulated as a game animal within the state of Texas, which they're not. So that's kind of startling. And folks, again, biological questions, don't understand the size of pig litters. Perhaps not as important in management. It is important when we talk about the propensity for these animals to breed prolifically. But most folks thought, overwhelmingly so, that pigs are native to Texas. That's frightening for us because it indicates that we might have crossed a threshold in society where pigs have been around long enough that folks are normalizing them as part of the landscape. Interestingly and kind of frighteningly, most folks think that wild pigs are the same or different species than domestic pigs. They do not correctly answer this question. Now, to make the point clear, in the introduction to our survey, we provide a clear explanation with graphics to show that we are not talking about javelina, collared peccaries, which are native to Texas, or anything else down here that might be a source of confusion. So, of course, you can say, well, John, folks might not have read that. That may be true, but we did at least go to the effort to show folks this is exactly how we define wild pig. Here is what they are. This is what we mean when we ask you these questions. Understanding, of course, that terms like feral hog, feral swine are commonly used even among our professional group. We went ahead and defined for folks what these are. So, overwhelmingly, many of these questions that we've asked folks and taught over the years, such as legal restrictions on what you can do with pigs, folks overwhelmingly don't know. For us as managers, if I cannot tell people something so basic as pigs aren't from here and it's illegal to release pigs, that's not good for us. That indicates that we've got some work left to do. In terms of what we've taught folks to do over the years, there are a number of management options in terms of direct control methods that we teach people. And we teach that there's a place for every tool. What you'll notice from what folks told us about what methods they do use, overwhelmingly, we do not encourage folks to engage in traditional hunting or ground shooting as a method to control pigs because it's not typically going to be a high take item. We do encourage folks to trap and destroy or trap and sell, up to them. And we do see that a lot of folks do indeed trap and destroy, which is great. But we see that a number of other things that we talk about really aren't used all that often. Most folks are still engaging either in traditional ground shooting or trapping and destroying, even though we have encouraged the use of some of these other tools, including aerial gunning, over the last 10 or so years. Now, it's important to talk a little bit about what we saw from folks in Texas that responded to us about hunting. Although we're talking about extension education, I'd also like to point out that these methods are something that we teach at our events. We teach intensively how to do these methods better to increase your efficacy and your volume of take. A little under 70% of our respondents told us that they did indeed hunt in Texas in 2018. That was our time frame of sampling our hunters. Okay, fair enough. They said that they hunted in Texas. A little over 70% of those folks said that they engaged in the act of wild pig hunting. Now, as we found out when we asked how many pigs did you actually take, that doesn't necessarily mean that they killed a pig. It means that they went on a trip to hunt pigs. Almost 20% of the folks that said, I went pig hunting, admitted they didn't kill a single pig during that hunt. Okay, fair enough. And that's in addition to that 30% of our overall sampling frame that said, I didn't hunt at all. That's not a thing I do. This, by the way, includes folks that tell us, I took pigs for damage management reasons. So we ask them, what was your reason for going hunting? And one of the answers you can give us is purely for damage management, not for recreation, all the way up to, oh, it's purely for recreation, I'm a trophy hunter. Anything's fine. But this includes everybody that was also hunting for damage management. So all told, the average pig hunter killed about 3 pigs in 2018. And understand, of course, that we have some folks that give very high numbers and a little bit of an outlandish answer. And we don't really have a way to suss out who's lying to us and who's not. We do know from previous studies that oftentimes when you ask folks to report take, they inflate their take a little bit for a variety of sociological reasons. So we know that folks are taking pigs, but they're not killing near as many as is thought. And this is generally because hunting is not a high take method, and we don't teach it as such. We know that folks enjoy pig hunting. We know that it can have a specific targeted use. It's not going to be a high take method, and yet folks continue to do this as though it is. In the world of trapping, which we spend an awful lot of time teaching, a little over 40% of our respondents did indeed trap wild pigs in Texas, whether they caught and sold them or whether they caught and destroyed them. And we couldn't ask them, of course, did you catch them and go release them somewhere, because that's illegal and that's entrapment. So we can't do that. But on average, our wild pig trapper tells us that they caught 6 pigs in 2018. Okay, that's not what we would like for it to be. And generally speaking, folks are not catching the high numbers in our experience because they're not going through the process of trapping. They're doing the physical activity to build the trap, and they set it for a night and they catch one dumb pig instead of an entire sounder. So we're not seeing this process permeate down to folks, even though we're teaching it. We're seeing just the building of the physical item, which we taught for many years without the process, and folks aren't getting that workflow correct. Again, very few people generally told us that they trapped and sold pigs, about 9%, but only about 3% of those folks tell us that they actually sold live pigs in 2018. So we don't know if folks are doing something nefarious, but there is a small market on deceased pigs being sold for the pet food industry for the most part. So it could be we have a few folks that are engaging in that. On average, though, most folks that sell pigs reported making $300 a year and selling about 25 pigs. So again, not a very high take item, and certainly not something that's going to be a damage management solution, but again, a little bit better than hunting. So folks are adopting these practices, but they're still not getting the kind of efficacy that we know is possible. Now, one thing that we've taught for many years is PPE. We have talked about zoonotic diseases, which of course we see that folks generally don't know, but we have talked about using PPE when you take and process wild pigs or when you just handle them in a trap. And so we were curious, how much are folks actually using and what items? And again, these are click all that apply, so percentages don't necessarily add up to 100. Most folks wore long sleeves and pants. Hey, that's great. And you might say, well, John, that's probably just an artifact of being outside. But again, we also live in Texas where it's rather hot, so most folks aren't necessarily wearing long sleeves unless they have to. So at least they're doing that. A lot of folks are wearing rubber gloves, which is fantastic. We've been trying to get folks to do that for years to cover wounds, to limit the possibility of infection transfer through open wounds on hands. And again, perhaps these responses are going to change post-2020 COVID-19 pandemic, who knows? But folks are using soap, disinfectants, things like that. But what we don't see is folks using face coverings or eyewear to keep these particulates that are perhaps items that can be transferred through respiratory paths out of their face and out of the soft tissue and the glandular tissue around their eyes. So we're not seeing much of that, but we are seeing some of these basic things being done. So in a broad sense, educational resources wise, about 33% of our folks told us that they actually attended some kind of AgriLife educational seminar or our predecessor agencies. on wild pigs. Fair enough. In these events, we teach a variety of things, most often basic pig biology and basic trapping methods. And we ask folks, of the things that you're learning today, how many do you intend to implement? So this is a typical metric for extension, right? How many new practices did you learn today and what will you use? We asked in our follow-up, which had never been done before, of all of the things that you learned in the program that you attended and you told us you were going to use, how many of them do you still use? Because again, if we're making permeating transformative education, folks would say, I still use almost all of them, except for perhaps something that's no longer relevant. Fair enough. Not even 25% of our respondents surveyed told us that they still use the things that they told us they were going to use back when they attended the event. This is a problem, right? So it's fewer than 9% of our folks have these long-term practice adoption that are our metrics of success. So that's not good for us. What about that can we do? Well, we asked about barriers to adoption of practices, and it's important to talk about some of these because generally speaking, they're going to be the things that make the difference for us in terms of whether or not we are getting good quality pig management on the ground. So I have some things here and I've highlighted, and I'll continue to add some highlights to this as we move on. So we asked a variety of things that could be barriers to practice adoption, from expenses, either time related or financial, applicability, physical difficulties. Many of our attendees are elderly folks. Did you have enough information? If you don't have enough information, then we've not done our job on a very basic level, as this is our state and federal mandate to do education. So we asked a variety of things, and you can see the breakdown, but to highlight, I break these items down into things we can change and things we might not be able to change because all of us have limitations in what we have the ability to do. So we have folks that tell us, these things are not applicable on my property, I saw no results, and I found these practices unimportant. We do have a very small percentage that say, look, I had confusion, I did not have had a lack of information, you didn't do your job. 2.8%, which is exceedingly low. We could probably live with that, but that is something I can change. I can do my educational practices better and teach folks better. The folks that told us they either didn't find any results using these practices or that they were unimportant, these are opportunities for us to do better education. When we ask in a short answer, give us more information if you want to, what folks told us was that when they didn't find any practices important, when they didn't find any results, I set the trap just like you said, and I only caught one pig. When we talk about corral style trapping, no matter what kind of configuration you're using, we want to take the time to bait the whole sounder and get them comfortable. But this is the process I mentioned earlier that we haven't always done a good job of teaching. And folks pointed this out to us that they did not know about the process. Rather, they're only thinking about the physical act of setting the trap. So we can do that better. We can focus on process and hands-on training rather than this broad general, here's how you build a good pig trap sense. Folks that tell me this method is not applicable on my property, we present stuff that's relevant to almost any person with any kind of property. So we can do things better in terms of correctly messaging when you use certain methods and when methods are most effective. Those are things we can do. Now, I've highlighted some things in red that question-wise, can we do something about them or can we not? I think they require some creativity. Folks told us overwhelmingly that it's too expensive and takes too much time to do pig management. For those of us that work in this world, this does not necessarily come as a surprise because it is much more laborious than folks initially think. And there are, of course, a variety of options to pig management, all of which cost something, but many of the options out there today cost quite a lot. So some folks might say, well, you don't have a bad enough problem if you're not willing to take the time and spend the money. But on the other hand, it's also important to recognize that almost 15% of our respondents said, I have physical limitations to the ability to do these things. That's not an insignificant proportion. So how do we do these things better? Some of it's perhaps a messaging approach, but there might be better ways to go about getting folks engaged in trapping rather than just saying, well, if it takes too much time or you have physical limitations, you need to hire a trapper. It could be that a private or public trapper is the right approach for these folks, using one of our wildlife services colleagues to do the actual technical trapping on the ground. That might be most appropriate. On the other hand, it may be that we have other ways to get at having these folks do trapping. So at the end of the day, how effective have we been with extension education to get folks to actually engage in pig management? Because to some extent, it's irrelevant to me how many folks know how many pigs are in an average litter. It's good to know, it provides reason to do the work, but in terms of practice adoption, we find that folks fairly low practice adopt, and yet they give us some very clear guidelines on how we can do better. So to wrap these things up a little bit, we know that a lot has changed since 1990 in the pig world, but also in the world of the Texas public and how they interact with pigs. So we identified some key patterns of clientele use of extension resources, some barriers to adoption, and we evaluated our effectiveness of getting education done. Some things we do really well, other things not so much. So we've got some recommendations in terms of how our educational efforts could and should be adapted in the near future in order to increase our effectiveness. So basically, when we look at these things, I ask myself the question of, are we effectively communicating pig management and the reason for doing this? So I talk about management critical education. What can we do better? We have to do a better job of emphasizing our methods of control rather than just the biology and laws, but obviously we need to do a better job of emphasizing to folks where the important biological items are and where they're not, but also this why of management. Why do we bother with pig management? If folks think that pigs are not terribly damaging to the environment, that they don't affect everybody in some way, or that their reproductive capacity is the same as collared peccaries, which are fairly low, then they might not think this is really much of a problem at all. Emphasizing the why of management is critical for us. Methodologically, we have to do a better job at getting folks to do these hands-on events where you see how I set the pig trap. What are the processes I go through in construction, in baiting, in monitoring? We talk in a broad sense about these things, but it's pretty clear that without a hands-on demonstration of these efficacious methods, folks simply aren't seeing adoption. In recent years, we have worked with our wildlife services counterparts in Texas to do what we call the Texas two-step locally, is that we go do education. We have wildlife services technicians and troubleshooters come and do demonstrations at educational events of how they do their work and the process they go through, and to show the results. It typically doesn't hurt to have a member or two of the audience be a landowner that wildlife services has done something very good with, to be able to speak up and say, hey, this actually works. It's not complicated. You can do it yourself, and here's how they did it. The other thing that we've hit on in recent months and in recent years is a better job of community organizing. To some extent, this takes the form of these educational events where we bring in our wildlife services partners and ourselves, but it also is coming in the form of trapping cooperatives. We are seeing in some localities in Texas where pig damage is an especially large problem that folks are starting to form groups of contiguous landowners to buy equipment together, to share equipment among one another, and to help one another set it up and deal with the process of trapping. This is actually coming on the heels and in the same region of our prescribed burn associations, which arose in the 1970s and 80s, which are landowner groups that do cooperative work doing prescribed burns on one another's properties. So it's a lot of peer learning, peer teaching, and peer technical support. One landowner may say, I don't have the expertise and the physical ability to do this kind of pig damage management, but our damage management affects all of our neighbors, so we do it together. This is a pretty salient way of approaching this, and it doesn't require more government money, and it doesn't require more government boots on the ground, which are especially limited. What it does require is engaged landowners getting more of their neighbors working together, no matter what methods you choose to use. But we're starting to see this rise on its own. Our emphasis within Extension is to start to seed these efforts a little bit out in the public to help them gain traction faster. So that is one way that we recommend moving into the future. We can do a better job of our educational efforts. We can train folks, but then that peer learning and peer passing of those good management practices are going to make the difference in the long run for us. So to wind down, I just want to say thank you very much. This was an incredibly large effort, which we'll be providing information out of in three different talks during this event, as well as over the years, there will be more items coming out of this as we go down the road. So Expect to see more from us in the next year or two regarding this survey effort, but we had a lot of partners in getting this done, and we couldn't have done it without all of them. I really want to thank all of the folks from wildlife services at various levels, the Texas Wildlife Services Program, the USDA Wildlife Services Program nationally, just absolutely incredible partners and support. Our colleagues and collaborators at the NWRC, fantastic folks. The National Feral Swine Program did so much to help us. Texas Parks and Wildlife Department for generously providing access to their database of licensed hunters, without which this process simply couldn't have been done. And other groups here in Texas, our master naturalists, master gardeners, Texas Wildlife Association, and the Texas and Southwestern cattle raisers for opening up their membership rosters to our survey efforts and allowing us to get a sense of what their members do, experience, and think about wild pigs. And so with all that being said, I appreciate your time today, listening to a little bit of our efforts down here at A Broad Sense. And if you do have questions, I strongly encourage you to reach out at your convenience. My email's here on the screen. And I look forward to hearing from you either there or in the comments section below the YouTube video for any questions you might have about our work. And stay tuned for future efforts where we put a variety of our results out in a more detailed or in-depth sense. So thank you very much for your time today, and I look forward to seeing all of you soon.